Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission today is really to cut through some of the noise. We want to give you a comprehensive shortcut to understanding, well, one of the most complex geopolitical tightropes in the world right now. That's the strategic balancing act of Southeast Asia, primarily between China and the United States.
Yeah, it's a tension that really defines the region. And for you, the listener, getting a handle on it means understanding that core conflict. How do these nations maximize the economic benefits? We're talking essential trade, huge infrastructure projects, railways, digital growth. How do they get all that while at the same time protecting their own sovereignty and strategic autonomy?
It's a tough walk.
It absolutely is. And that tightrope walk seems to be getting, well, significantly trickier, especially as the pull, the gravitational pull of one power becomes almost irresistible. So today we're synthesizing forecasts for 2024, 2025. We're also digging into China's long game, historically speaking, that good neighborliness policy. And crucially, we're analyzing that sort of invisible battleground, digital finance. And the big headline right now, the one that really defines this moment, comes from the Lowy Institute's recent analysis. The headline is pretty stark. China has actually, for the first time, become the most influential external power in Southeast Asia. And we should be clear, this isn't just a tiny margin. It's described as a strategic reversal.
A narrow lead, but yeah, decisive. The Lowy analysis mentions what they call a China first reversal. Their influence now narrowly edges out the United States, and our sources are confirming that 7 out of the 10 ASEAN members, they're now leaning towards Beijing as their most influential partner.
7 out of 10. Just, think about the strategic weight of that number. This isn't just the smaller states right on the border. We're talking major players here. Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Laos, they're all part of that group tilting towards China. That figure, 50.5% influence, it really feels like crossing a psychological threshold, maybe a strategic one too. It strongly suggests that the economic gravity, the sheer volume of trade, the investment from China over decades, it's finally tipping the scales in these big influence surveys.
Right, but here's where we really need to stress the nuance. This is critical for you listening to grasp. This most influential status. It's a narrow lead, it's a highly contested region, it's definitely not dominance. It doesn't mean the U.S. is suddenly irrelevant.
Precisely. That's a key point. If you look at the overall influence scores, Beijing and Washington are, frankly, in a league of their own. No other external partner, not Japan, not India, not the EU, they don't come anywhere close to the total influence levels of the U.S. and China.
Yeah.
So it's really a duel between these two superpowers, and right now one is just slightly ahead. By a nose, maybe.
Okay, so let's unpack that. How did China actually achieve that narrow edge? The Lowy Index isn't based on just one thing, right? It's a pretty detailed scorecard. What are those 5 pillars they use to measure influence, and where did China really pull ahead?
Yeah, it's quite comprehensive. They measure influence across 5 key areas: economic relationships, defense networks, diplomatic influence, cultural influence, and regional engagement. These are really designed to capture the whole spectrum. Soft power, hard power, the lot.
And when you break down those 5 categories, China's success seems really concentrated. 2 major areas that just affect everyone in the region.
That's exactly right. China ranks first overall for economic relationships. That's huge. And critically, also for diplomatic influence. What really jumps out when you look at the data is China's consistency. The analysis describes it as pervasive influence. It's highly consistent across almost all 11 nations they surveyed. Beijing is just present everywhere.
And that consistency, it contrasts really sharply with the U.S., doesn't it? The U.S. is obviously the indispensable military power, but its influence seems much more concentrated.
Yeah, concentrate is a good word. The U.S. remains the absolutely essential security partner, but really only for 2 key maritime states, Philippines and Singapore. Elsewhere, U.S. influence varies a lot more. It's often more peripheral presence, especially in mainland nations like Laos or Cambodia.
Okay, so that brings us to the first big driver behind this shift. China's sheer economic muscle.
ASEAN is now China's single largest trading partner globally. The scale of that trade, combined with those massive, very visible Belt and Road infrastructure projects, it just creates this incredibly powerful, almost magnetic pull.
And you could argue that pull was maybe amplified by a perception of U.S. unreliability, particularly the, let's say, policy volatility from Washington during the previous administration. The analysis points directly to that, the erosion of U.S. clout under Trump. We saw things like heavy tariffs hitting Southeast Asian states, foreign aid budgets being slashed, tighter migration policies.
Yeah, and the takeaway for a policymaker in, say, Hanoi or Jakarta might have been, well, China, despite being closer and maybe historically more complex, seemed to offer a more reliable path,
Right.
or at least a more predictable strategic partnership long term. Compared to the sort of political whiplash they felt from the U.S. side, the U.S. was often seen through that security lens, but then seemed to put its own domestic stuff, like trade protectionism, ahead of the economic stability of its supposed partners in the region.
So if the choice is between predictable investment, even with strings attached, and unpredictable policy swings, the choice becomes pretty pragmatic, doesn't it? And we actually see that pragmatism showing up in the numbers, in the bilateral relationship scores. They show ties improving, even between countries with pretty serious ongoing disputes.
Absolutely. Look at the scores between January 2022 and April 2024. China-Indonesia, which has had, complex maritime issues, investment challenges, their relationship score went up from 5.1 to 5.7. And even more striking, China-Vietnam, a country with major South China Sea disputes, centuries of friction. Their score increased from 5.3 to 5.9.
Wow, that's really tangible proof. It suggests that no matter how intense the friction gets, maybe over territory or history, that hard-nosed economic pragmatism is just winning out for these governments. They seem to be actively choosing to improve ties, build political trust, strengthen economic links, even with those geopolitical flashpoints burning in the background.
And that leads us right into the second major driver: political trust and pragmatism. This isn't accidental. It's built through constant, high-level interaction. It's a deliberate strategy. Leaders from Indonesia, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, they've all been meeting frequently with their Chinese counterparts, keeping those lines of communication wide open.
And the analysis suggests these aren't just, photo ops. They're seen as deliberate efforts to build real rapport, mutual understanding at the very top. It signals this sort of unified desire among the regional elite to keep the relationship developing, to choose engagement, keep the economic flow going, rather than letting friction, whether it from Washington or the South China Sea, derail their own domestic economic agendas.
Yeah.
They're putting the economy first. Full stop. Okay, now let's connect this big picture, the macro political shift, down to the micro level, the everyday reality. Because this is where it gets really interesting, I think. We're moving from steel beams and diplomatic handshakes to the digital wallet. This is the digital battleground. And Southeast Asia's mobile payment market is just exploding, projected $215 billion this year alone.
And the growth rate is, well, it's staggering. A 25% compound annual growth rate expected for the region. This is obviously a critical market if you want control over data, financial standards, future influence. And Chinese tech giants, Ant Financial with Alipay, Tencent with WeChat Pay, they saw early on they needed to be deeply involved.
So what was their first move? Phase one, maybe between 2015 and 2017? How did they try to get in initially?
It was what we call the tourist strategy. It was laser-focused on China's absolutely massive outbound tourism market. Millions of Chinese visitors were pouring into places like Thailand, Malaysia. Alipay and WeChat Pay basically just let these tourists spend their familiar RMB directly through their apps in local shops, restaurants, whatever.
Yeah.
No need to exchange currency.
And that must have been incredibly effective just for getting the brands seen, right? Normalizing them.
Hugely effective for visibility. We saw transaction volumes from Chinese tourists in Thailand, for example, increase sixfold incredibly quickly. It basically forced local retailers in high-traffic areas, the 7-Elevens, big supermarkets, to adopt Chinese payment terminals almost overnight just to capture that tourist spending.
But then came phase two. It showed the limits of just going head-to-head, didn't it?
It did. Because unlike in China, where digital payments were really driven by massive e-commerce platforms like Taobao, Southeast Asia saw powerful local and regional players emerge first. These super apps like Grab, Gojek in Indonesia and Singapore, or even government-backed initiatives like Thailand's Prompt Pay system, run by their domestic payment network, ITMX.
So Chinese apps struggled to get local Southeast Asians to adopt them for daily use because these trusted local incumbents were already there.
Exactly. They already owned the day-to-day local transactions. Plus, there were specific local conditions. For instance, the source material points out that some of the complex financial products Alipay offered were maybe too complicated. Thais, for example, apparently have relatively low financial management knowledge compared to other countries. That made some features harder to adopt.
Interesting. So that resistance forced a pivot, right, to phase three, the globalization strategy.
Get the term, yeah. Since they couldn't just overwhelm the local players directly in the local markets, they changed tack. They essentially decided, if you can't beat them, join them. This strategy involves buying up significant stakes, minority or sometimes majority equity in the leading local digital wallets.
Okay, let's define globalization a bit more for the listener. It sounds like blending global and local, but what does it really mean in practice for financial influence?
It means embedding influence, but quietly. So think about Gcash in the Philippines or the Touch and Go e-wallet in Malaysia. By buying significant stakes in these local champions, even if it's not a controlling stake, Chinese technology, their financial architecture, gets embedded deep inside these trusted local platforms. It ensures they influence the technical standards, the underlying tech, and crucially, the flow of financial data, all without needing their own brand name, Alipay or WeChat Pay, to be the dominant icon on your phone screen. It's influenced through controlling the plumbing, essentially, not through brand recognition.
Wow, that's a pretty sophisticated strategy, securing long-term influence over data over the financial infrastructure, but using trusted local brands as the front. And this sophisticated approach, it leads to this really surprising finding, the public approval paradox from that Frey University at Berlin survey.
Yes, exactly. The survey found, perhaps surprisingly, a high level of overall public approval for Chinese investment in mobile payment platforms, CIM. Around 57% approval across the region, and it was huge in Thailand, 69% approval. So citizens seem generally okay with this digital investment in their wallets.
And here's the paradox we need to explore. People feel very differently when it comes to visible physical infrastructure, right? Only 7% rank Chinese firms first for building things like roads or railways. They overwhelmingly preferred domestic, Western, or other Asian companies for that. Why such a huge difference in acceptance?
I think it highlights a really key insight into that tightrope walk we mentioned. Physical infrastructure, a massive railway, a dam, a seaport, it's highly visible. It's often disruptive during construction. It requires huge amounts of land, often involves foreign labor, and it's almost always linked to massive debt. It can feel like an imposition on national sovereignty in a very direct way.
Whereas a minority stake in my local mobile payment app champion is, well, invisible to me as a user. It feels like an investment that helps a company I already trust expand, offer better services. I get the benefit, maybe a better app, more features, without that visible, debt-laden intrusion of a giant physical project.
Exactly. The digital investment is often accepted because it feels like a low-visibility, non-disruptive way to modernize. But, this is the crucial but, even with that high approval for the investment itself, the survey shows deep underlying anxiety about the implications. A huge majority, 87%, rank data privacy as highly important when choosing a mobile payment app. And depending on the country, somewhere between 50% and 70% reported having negative feelings or concerns if they knew Chinese companies had access to their personal financial transaction data.
So it's like the digital investment is accepted pragmatically, but the strategic implications, who controls my personal data, that's met with real, consistent public skepticism. It's a very delicate balance for governments, isn't it? They want the investment, but they also have to manage a population that's deeply concerned about privacy and data control.
Absolutely. And this immense pressure, this competition, economic, military, and now digital, it creates this deep strategic fault line running right across the region. It geographically divides the types of challenges policymakers are grappling with.
Right, we're talking about that fundamental split, maritime Southeast Asia versus mainland Southeast Asia. Let's start with the maritime bloc. These are often called the core hedgers. We're talking Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia.
These are the big archipelagic states. Their strategic focus is, almost by definition, tied to traditional maritime security. Things like ensuring freedom of navigation, managing those tricky South China Sea disputes, keeping vital sea lanes open. Their geography naturally pushes them to be open to multiple partners, the U.S., Japan, India, Europe, for trade and security.
And this is where the U.S. maintains that crucial, maybe irreplaceable advantage in deep defense networks. These maritime states tend to view the U.S. as the essential balancing partner, the necessary counterweight against a potential China trying to dominate the South China Sea.
And that inherent tension is exactly why we've seen one member of this bloc, the Philippines, move towards what analysts call de-hedging. Hedging means, maintaining strategic ambiguity, keeping ties balanced between the big powers. De-hedging is when a country makes a conscious shift away from that strict neutrality, leaning more towards one side. In Manila's case, towards the U.S.
And the evidence for that shift is pretty undeniable, isn't it? Manila has significantly ramped up security cooperation with Washington, much bigger joint military exercises, and critically, granting the U.S. access to 4 new bases under that Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA. That feels like a direct response to China's actions in contested waters.
It certainly looks that way. Now, here's a crucial insight for you listening. How does the rest of that hedging bloc see this move by the Philippines? The analysis seems clear. Most other ASEAN states are actively trying not to get dragged into this escalating China-Philippines conflict. They're sticking firmly to the classic hedging strategy. They're prioritizing regional economic stability, ASEAN cohesion, over explicitly aligning with Manila's more confrontational security posture. They seem unwilling to jeopardize the economic benefits they get from Beijing.
Okay, so that's the maritime dynamic. Now let's contrast that with the mainland bloc, often seen as more China-leaning. We're talking Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam here.
Yeah, their relationship with China is fundamentally different because it's immediate, it's physical, they share long land borders. Their integration with China is heavily driven by the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. This brings intense physical connectivity, railways, roads, dams, but it also carries very high risks to their sovereignty and governance structures.
And the prime example here is probably the China-Laos Railway, right?
It's the quintessential example. The railway itself, opened in 2021, has definitely boosted trade and connectivity. It's created a vital land link. But the cost? The cost is enormous. Laos is now saddled with absolutely massive Chinese debt. And the loan terms often grant Beijing control over strategic assets if Laos defaults. This gives Beijing just huge leverage over Laotian economic policy, future choices.
So that's the double-edged sword of the BRI right there.
It really is. And the rapid integration these projects demand. It has consequences beyond just debt. The sources talk about the rise of these unregulated zones, special economic zones, or SEZs, often funded by Chinese capital along the borders. Because of their remote locations, maybe the size of the investment, these zones can become almost quasi-sovereign areas, places where local laws, like Laos's laws, might not fully reach or aren't consistently enforced.
And what are the actual costs of these zones? What kind of unregulated activity are we talking about?
Well, reports detail them becoming major hotspots for things like wildlife crime, illegal logging, or resource extraction. And increasingly, these large-scale online scam operations, huge compounds, we're talking organized crime, often involving unregulated labor migration, sometimes Chinese nationals, running sophisticated scams targeting people across Asia and even globally. These zones really erode state sovereignty from within and create immense governance challenges. It's a huge hidden cost that has to be weighed against the economic benefits of the railway connection.
So the tightrope is maybe even more challenging for these mainland states. They get the immediate economic upside, connectivity, trade, but they risk their fiscal future and their internal security by potentially creating these ungoverned spaces right on their borders.
Absolutely. The pressure in the mainland feels very physical, very economic. Whereas in the maritime states, it's predominantly about security, naval presence, freedom of navigation, different pressures, same balancing act.
Okay, let's shift focus again slightly. Let's look back at China's historical long game. The multi-pronged strategy that really laid the groundwork, built the trust and access for the influence we see today. This patience goes back decades.
It really does. The good neighborliness policy, which started way back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, it's a multi-dimensional strategy designed specifically to cultivate stability, security, and eventually maybe loyalty among China's immediate neighbors. It seems to have 4 key pillars.
Okay, pillar 1 sounds like pure political support.
Yeah, basically unqualified backing for the ruling regimes, especially those facing Western pressure. Think of the military junta in Myanmar after '88, or the communist parties running Laos and Vietnam. China provides them with political insurance, shields them from pressure over democracy, human rights, governance. This ensures that friendly, predictable, stable governments stay in power right on China's borders.
Pillar 2 is about strategic engagement, reducing friction, securing access routes.
Exactly. It focuses heavily on making sure the borders are stable and securing transit routes for China. A major diplomatic win here was settling that incredibly complex land and sea boundary with Vietnam over 2,600 kilometers long. By using the UNCLOS framework, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea back in the mid-90s, China managed to normalize ties, remove a huge source of friction, and really pave the way for economic cooperation to boom.
Then pillar 3 is the economic cooperation, the BRI, trade, aid, which we've discussed. But pillar 4 sounds much more sensitive, touching on domestic politics, the role of the overseas Chinese community.
Yeah, this is where historical anxieties really meet modern geopolitics. Southeast Asia has a long, sometimes traumatic history of suspicion about the political loyalty of its ethnic Chinese populations. Beijing knows this is a sensitive point. We saw an attempt to reassure people just recently. In 2024, a senior diplomat publicly stated that citizens owe political loyalty only to their adopted countries.
Okay, that sounds like the standard diplomatic line, but how does that mesh with China's bigger goal of national rejuvenation, uniting the Chinese nation?
Well, the sources suggest there's a deliberate ambiguity, maybe a blurring of the line, especially under recent leadership. They actively promote this concept of Zhongguominu, often translated as the overarching Chinese nation. It's an expansive cultural idea that includes all ethnic Chinese globally, regardless of their citizenship, and it kind of urges them to contribute to China's rise.
Huh. So, on one hand, the official diplomatic message is be loyal where you live. But on the other hand, the state policy encourages global ethnic Chinese to contribute to the motherland's rise.
Precisely. And that creates this inherent friction. It fuels those old anxieties in places like Indonesia or Malaysia about potential split loyalties, especially if Beijing's interests clash with the host country's interests. It's this persistent, low-level tension that China seems to manage carefully, but maybe never fully relinquishes as a potential tool of influence.
Okay, let's pivot now to maybe China's most significant military gain in the region. That's the access granted by Myanmar, particularly after the 1988 military crackdown and the Western sanctions that followed.
Yes, this was absolutely critical for the isolated military junta back then. China stepped in and became their indispensable partner. The cooperation took off almost immediately, not just with political cover, but with hard military kit.
And the payment method was unique, wasn't it, that barter model? How did Myanmar pay for Chinese weapons without access to foreign cash or international banks?
Instead of cash or loans, Myanmar essentially traded valuable commodities, things like rice, teak wood, jade, gems. They traded those directly for Chinese military hardware, fighter jets, naval vessels, small arms. This created a vital supply chain that completely bypassed the Western sanctions regime.
And this military cooperation eventually granted China that crucial foothold in the Indian Ocean, right? Significantly boosting its strategic reach, addressing a key vulnerability.
Absolutely. Starting really in the early 1990s, China worked patiently to gain access to strategic islands along Myanmar's coast. Coco Island is the most famous, also Zadeki Kyun. China has reportedly been installing naval listening posts, signals intelligence, SIGINT facilities, sophisticated radar surveillance equipment there over the years.
And why are those specific islands so critical from an intelligence perspective? What are they looking for?
They serve two huge strategic purposes. First, they allow China to monitor commercial shipping traffic going through the Strait of Malacca, that critical global choke point vital for China's energy security and trade. Second, and maybe even more crucially, they monitor the military activities of rival powers, specifically India. Coco Island is geographically very close to India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands, where India conducts important missile tests and has key military bases.
So these facilities basically act as forward observation posts, extending Beijing's eyes and ears deep into the Indian Ocean basin, helping address what analysts sometimes call the Malacca dilemma, China's fear that rivals could cut off its vital sea lanes.
Exactly. It's a vital piece of their long-term security puzzle. That forward access is an enormous geopolitical win, and it was secured through decades of patient political and economic groundwork with Myanmar.
Okay, so let's try and bring all these different threads together now. From those historical border deals and the military listening posts in the Indian Ocean to the sheer economic pull and this invisible digital battle. It sounds like three big forces really define Southeast Asia's new normal as it navigates all this immense pressure.
I think that's right. Force number one, the geopolitical realignment. That narrow but clear tilt towards China seems driven by cold, hard economic necessity. For the elites in power across most of the region, that pragmatic pursuit of predictable economic stability and growth appears to be overriding almost every other concern.
And this tilt gets reinforced by that perceived unpredictability from the U.S. side. Policy uncertainty on trade, on long-term commitment. It makes the calculation to lean more towards China maybe understandable, even if it carries its own risks for these policymakers.
Then, force number two, that deep strategic fault line. The fundamental split in the type of challenges faced by mainland versus maritime Southeast Asia. The mainland is grappling with the double-edged sword of intense physical connectivity, the benefits of BRI railways versus the deep risks of sovereign debt, control over the Mekong River via dams, and that social fallout from those quasi-sovereign, unregulated zones.
While the maritime states are focused on traditional naval security, freedom of navigation, and desperately trying to maintain that hedging posture, often struggling, like we see with the Philippines, making that difficult choice to de-hedge towards the U.S. for security guarantees.
And finally, force number 3, the subtle digital battleground. Chinese fintech giants didn't necessarily win the initial head-to-head fight for local users everywhere, but they pivoted very cleverly to that globalization strategy.
Right. By quietly buying into the local champions, Gcash, Touch and Go, and others, they ensure Chinese tech, data standards, financial architecture get embedded deep within the region's booming financial systems, securing a really powerful long-term foothold in the digital economy, often without their own brand being front and center.
It really is a profound multi-layered strategy. China's employing military, economic, diplomatic, and digital tools simultaneously. And it highlights why that narrow edge they've now achieved, according to studies like Loewy's, is actually so significant.
It's a truly remarkable demonstration of patient, long-term strategic influence building in an incredibly complex and fragmented part of the world. And that balancing act for Southeast Asia, it only seems to get harder from here. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into China's narrow edge.
It was a pleasure sharing these insights.
And thank you, as always, for listening. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.